The year 2024 has been a dark year for human rights in Indonesia, stained by a string of disturbing incidents of police brutality. From January to November, reports from organizations like Amnesty International Indonesia and Contras paint a grim picture. There have been 116 recorded cases of police brutality. This includes a chilling 29 extrajudicial killings. Furthermore, Contras documented 62 acts of torture by law enforcement, impacting 128 victims. These numbers represent not just statistics, but real lives shattered and a growing climate of fear. The Indonesian people have long grappled with the issue of excessive force by those meant to protect them. The right to peaceful assembly and freedom of expression, cornerstones of any democracy, have been repeatedly trampled upon. This year, the situation has reached a fever pitch, sparking outrage and demands for accountability. The violence meted out by the police is not random, it is systemic. It speaks to a deeper malaise within the institution, a culture of impunity that allows such actions to continue unchecked. The lack of transparency and accountability only emboldens perpetrators, further eroding public trust. The question remains, how long will this continue? How many more lives must be lost? How many more voices silenced before meaningful change is implemented? The answer lies not in empty promises, but in concrete action. The Indonesian people deserve better. They deserve a police force that protects, not brutalizes, a system that upholds justice, not perpetuates violence. August 2024 witnessed a wave of protests across Indonesia, sparked by controversial changes to the election law. These protests were met with a brutal crackdown by security forces, turning the streets into battlegrounds. Amnesty International Indonesia reported a staggering 579 civilians arbitrarily arrested. The world watched in horror as images emerged of Indonesian security forces using excessive force against unarmed civilians. The use of tear gas, often indiscriminate and in confined spaces, led to numerous cases of respiratory distress. Journalists tasked with documenting the events were not spared. Reporters Without Borders documented at least 11 cases of journalists being injured or having their equipment damaged. In Jakarta, Bandung, and other cities, journalists were beaten, threatened, and forced to delete footage, highlighting a blatant attempt to stifle press freedom. The August crackdown was a stark reminder of the fragility of democratic space in Indonesia. It exposed the willingness of those in power to resort to violence, to silence dissent, and control the narrative. The heavy-handed response served only to further inflame tensions and deepen the divide between the people and those who govern them. If August was a wake-up call, November was a deafening alarm. The month began with the tragic death of a 17-year-old high school student, shot and killed by a police officer in what can only be described as a senseless act of violence. This incident, a chilling reminder of the unchecked power wielded by some within the police force, ignited a firestorm of anger and grief across the nation. On November 28th, thousands took to the streets of Semarang, gathering in front of the Central Java police station to demand justice and an end to police brutality. The protests, fueled by anger and a deep sense of betrayal, were met with a heavy police presence, but remained largely peaceful. The death of the young student, a symbol of innocence lost, has become a rallying cry for change. Civil society groups, student activists, and ordinary citizens alike have united in their condemnation of police brutality and their demand for accountability. This tragic incident has ripped open old wounds, exposing the raw underbelly of a system that has long failed to protect its citizens. The events of 2024, particularly the surge in police brutality, have cast a long shadow over Indonesia's future. They have shaken the very foundations of Indonesian democracy. leaving citizens questioning the state's commitment to protecting their fundamental rights. Activists have declared a state of emergency for human rights in the country, a desperate plea for attention and action. The Indonesian government can no longer ignore the calls for comprehensive police reform. This is not merely about retraining officers or implementing cosmetic changes. It requires a fundamental shift in the police culture, one that prioritizes human rights, accountability, and transparency. External oversight of the police force is crucial, with independent bodies empowered to investigate allegations of abuse and hold perpetrators accountable. Furthermore, civil society must be given a seat at the table, actively involved in shaping policies and monitoring police conduct. The fight for justice and human rights in Indonesia is far from over. The path ahead will be long and arduous, requiring unwavering commitment from both the government and its people. The future of Indonesia, its democracy, and its international standing hinge on the choices made today. The world is watching, waiting to see if Indonesia will rise to the challenge and choose the path of justice and reform.